Memphis, Egypt, 2200 BC. The pharaoh's officials are standing at the Nilometer, the stepped stone structure cut into the riverbank that measures the height of the annual flood, and the number staring back at them is wrong. Not slightly wrong, catastrophically wrong. The flood that should be inundating the floodplain with the black silt that has fed Egypt for 1,000 years has arrived weak, late, and shallow. The fields that should be underwater are dry. The grain reserves that the state has stockpiled against an ordinary bad year are not built for what is actually happening. This is not one bad flood. It is the beginning of a climate event that will last more than a century, and it is not happening only on the Nile. At the exact same time, in Mesopotamia, the Akkadian Empire, the world's first true empire, built by Sargon a century and a half earlier, is watching its agricultural heartland turn to dust as the rains that feed northern Mesopotamia fail. At the exact same time, in the Indus Valley, the great cities of Harappa and Mohenjo-Daro are beginning a decline that will, within a few centuries, see them abandoned entirely. At the exact same time, in China, the sophisticated jade-working Liangzhu culture near the Yangtze Delta is collapsing as flooding and climate disruption overwhelm its hydraulic infrastructure. 4 of the most advanced civilizations on Earth, separated by thousands of kilometers and having no contact with one another, begin to fail within decades of each other. This is not coincidence. Modern climate science has identified the mechanism, a global climate event beginning around 2200 BC, severe enough that geologists have named an entire subdivision of the geological timescale after it. The Meghalayan age, the current geological age in which we still live today, officially begins at this exact moment, defined by a layer of stalagmite in a cave in India that records the precise onset of a multi-century megadrought. The pharaohs did not know what was happening to them. They knew only that the river had stopped behaving the way it always had, and that the state built on its predictability was not built to survive its absence. Egyptian civilization, more completely than almost any other in human history, is the direct product of a single environmental variable, the predictability of the Nile flood. Every year, snowmelt and monsoon rains in the Ethiopian highlands send a flood pulse down the Nile that arrives in Egypt with such regularity that the entire civilization has been organized around anticipating it. The flood begins in June, peaks in September, and recedes by November, depositing a layer of nutrient-rich black silt across the floodplain that requires no fertilizer, no crop rotation, and minimal irrigation effort to produce some of the most reliable agricultural yields in the ancient world. The Egyptians call their country Kemet, the Black Land, after this silt, distinguishing it from Deshret, the red land of the surrounding desert that supports no agriculture at all. This predictability is the foundation of everything Egypt builds. The pharaonic state's legitimacy rests on the theological claim that the king's divine relationship with the gods ensures the flood arrives on schedule. The administrative apparatus, scribes, granary officials, tax collectors, exists to measure the flood's height through the nilometers positioned at intervals along the river, predict the harvest from that measurement, and calculate the tax obligations of every province accordingly. The labor mobilization that builds the pyramids depends on a predictable agricultural calendar that frees tens of thousands of farmers during the months when the floodwaters make fieldwork impossible. By 2200 BC, Egypt has been operating this system for roughly 8 centuries. Through the unification of Upper and Lower Egypt and the construction of the Old Kingdom's most extraordinary monuments, the pyramids of Giza, built a few centuries earlier under Khufu, Khafra, and Menkaure, are already ancient by the standards of the people living through the crisis that is about to unfold. The Egyptian state has never, in its administrative memory, encountered a flood failure that lasted more than a single season. Its entire fiscal and political system assumes that bad years are temporary aberrations that grain reserves and administrative flexibility can absorb. What arrives starting around 2200 BC is not a bad year. It is a sustained collapse in flood reliability that persists, with some fluctuation, for well over a century. The pharaoh ruling Egypt as the crisis deepens is Pepi II, whose reign, beginning as a child around 2278 BC and lasting, according to ancient sources, an improbable 90+ years, becomes a case study in what happens when a centralized state's administrative capacity outlasts its ability to actually administer anything. The early signs are visible in the inscriptions that provincial governors, the nomarchs, leave in their tombs. In earlier periods, nomarchs boast of the wealth and grain they have sent to the royal treasury. During the crisis, the boasts change character entirely. The nomarch Anktefi, governing the province of Hierakonpolis during the worst years of the drought, leaves an inscription that has become one of the most important primary sources for this entire catastrophe. He describes Upper Egypt as dying of hunger, to the point that everyone had come to eating their children. He describes feeding the starving from his own grain stores, while neighboring provinces fail to do the same. Whether his account is literally accurate or self-promotional exaggeration carved to celebrate his own generosity, the social conditions it describes, famine severe enough to be remembered as cannibalism, the breakdown of normal interprovincial cooperation, regional governors acting as independent powers rather than royal subordinates, are corroborated by archaeological and textual evidence from across Egypt in this period. The central government's capacity to respond is structurally undermined by the very system that made the Old Kingdom prosperous. The pyramid-building economy has concentrated administrative and religious authority in the figure of the pharaoh and the priesthood serving the royal mortuary cults, while provincial governance has gradually devolved real power to the nomarchs who control local grain stores and local labor. When the flood fails repeatedly, and the central granaries cannot supplement every province simultaneously, the nomarchs, who do have local reserves, gain power relative to a center that increasingly cannot deliver on its core promise of distributing surplus. Provinces that manage their own crisis well become more autonomous. Provinces that manage badly become dependent or collapse into local breakdown. Either way, the unified administrative structure that Old Kingdom Egypt depends on begins to fracture along provincial lines. Pepi II dies, by the most common traditional reckoning, around 2184 BC. The Old Kingdom does not survive him in any functional sense. What follows is the first intermediate period, roughly a century and a half of fragmented competing local dynasties, weakened central authority, and the kind of political and social disorder that later Egyptian texts remember as a time when the natural order itself seemed to have broken. The literary text known as the Admonitions of Ipuwer, almost certainly composed somewhat later, but describing or reflecting on conditions from this general era, paints a picture of a world inverted. The poor have become rich, and the rich have become poor. The river has turned to blood, the land is full of marauders, and no one can find safety anywhere. Whatever its precise historical accuracy, it captures the cultural memory of a society confronting the failure of everything it believed was permanent. While the Nile fails, a parallel catastrophe is unfolding in Mesopotamia, where the Akkadian Empire, built by Sargon of Akkad around 2334 BC into history's first true multi-ethnic territorial empire, is experiencing the same climatic mechanism applied to a different hydrological system with equally devastating results. Unlike Egypt, which depends on a single predictable river flood, northern Mesopotamia depends substantially on rainfall agriculture, supplementing the irrigation systems of the river valleys. The 4.2 kilo-year event manifests in this region as a sharp and sustained reduction in rainfall, turning the agricultural heartland of northern Mesopotamia, the region that fed the Akkadian state's military and administrative core, into conditions too dry to sustain the dry farming wheat and barley cultivation the empire's tax base depends on. The archaeological evidence for this collapse is unusually direct because of work conducted at Tel Leilan, a site in northeastern Syria that was a major Akkadian provincial center. Excavations there reveal an abrupt abandonment layer dated to approximately 2200 BC, a thin band of wind-blown dust, free of the organic material that characterizes occupied settlement layers, indicating the site was suddenly empty and exposed to erosion rather than gradually depopulated. The site remains abandoned for roughly 3 centuries. Soil analysis from the region confirms a dramatic increase in aridity precisely at this horizon, consistent with the broader climatic signal found in ice cores, cave deposits, and lake sediments across the wider region. The Akkadian imperial administration, like its Egyptian counterpart, depends on tax revenue extracted from agricultural surplus to fund its military, its bureaucracy, and the tribute relationships that hold its provincial territories in line. When the northern agricultural zones fail simultaneously, the empire loses both the tax base that funds its central authority and the buffer region that has separated its core territories from the semi-nomadic peoples of the Zagros Mountains and the northern steppe, who are themselves displaced by the same drought and pushed toward the remaining productive land controlled by Akkad. Akkadian royal inscriptions from the final decades of the empire describe famine, the breakdown of trade, and military campaigns against groups identified as the Gutians, highland peoples who, in the traditional Mesopotamian historical memory, are blamed for the empire's collapse through invasion. Modern climate-focused scholarship suggests a more complicated causality. The Gutian incursions are likely as much a symptom of the same drought-driven displacement affecting the highlands as they are an independent cause of Akkadian collapse. A weakened agricultural state facing a wave of climate refugees from collapsing pastoral economies is a recipe for political fragmentation regardless of which side initiates the violence. The Akkadian Empire effectively dissolves within a generation or two of the climate shift's onset. The administrative innovations it pioneered, centralized taxation across a multi-ethnic territory, a standing professional army, a unified legal and bureaucratic language imposed across diverse populations, do not disappear, but the specific political structure that Sargon built does not survive the drought that arrives roughly a century and a half after he founded it. The reason this period commands such intense scientific interest is not simply that 2 major Bronze Age civilizations collapsed around the same time. Coincidental timing is common enough in history that 2 unrelated collapses centuries apart could easily appear to align. What makes the 4.2 kilo-year event different is the density and geographic spread of the physical evidence pointing to a single, synchronized global climate disruption. The type-defining evidence comes from a stalagmite in Maumlu Cave in Meghalaya in northeastern India, whose layered mineral deposits, laid down year by year over millennia, like tree rings made of stone, show a sharp, sustained shift in oxygen isotope ratios beginning almost exactly 4,200 years before the present, indicating an abrupt and sustained weakening of the Indian monsoon. This signal is so precise and so well dated that the International Commission on Stratigraphy used it in 2018 to formally define the start of the Meghalayan Age, the most recent subdivision of geological time, making the 4.2 kilo-year event one of the few climate disruptions in Earth's history significant enough to provide the official boundary marker for a unit of the geological timescale itself. The same monsoon weakening that the Maumlu stalagmite records is the mechanism connecting all of these otherwise unrelated regional catastrophes. The Indian monsoon system and the broader patterns of Northern Hemisphere atmospheric circulation, it interacts with influence rainfall not just over India, but across a vast swath of Africa, the Middle East, and Central and East Asia. A weakening of this system simultaneously reduces the monsoon rains that feed the Ethiopian highlands, and therefore the Nile flood, reduces the rainfall reaching northern Mesopotamia, disrupts the monsoon-dependent agriculture of the Indus Valley, and alters precipitation patterns affecting the river systems of eastern China. Lake sediment cores from Africa, ice cores from peaks in South America and the Alps, and cave deposits across multiple continents all show consistent evidence of the same disruption occurring within the same narrow window of time. In the Indus Valley, the consequence is not a sudden Egyptian-style political collapse, but a more gradual transformation. The great planned cities of Mohenjo-Daro and Harappa, with their sophisticated drainage systems and standardized urban planning, experience declining monsoon rainfall that undermines the agricultural surplus supporting urban density. Over the following centuries, the population disperses from the large cities, towards smaller, more dispersed agricultural settlements. And the distinctive Indus script and seal-based administrative system that had unified the civilization gradually fades from use. It is a slower unraveling than the Akkadian or Old Kingdom collapse, but climate researchers increasingly connect its onset to the same 4.2 kilo-year disruption. In China, the sophisticated Liangzhu culture, centered near modern Hangzhou and renowned for its elaborate jade carving tradition and large-scale water management systems, experiences catastrophic flooding events around this same period, a seemingly contradictory but climatically coherent outcome, since shifts in monsoon intensity can produce both drought in some regions and extreme flooding in others, depending on local hydrology and the specific way atmospheric circulation patterns reorganize. The flooding overwhelms the dikes and water control infrastructure that the Liangzhu economy depends on, and the culture's distinctive material traditions disappear from the archaeological record within a few generations. What the 4.2 kilo-year event reveals, viewed across all four civilizations simultaneously, is not that climate alone destroys societies. It is that the specific administrative architecture a society builds during good centuries determines how catastrophically it fails during bad ones. Egypt's Old Kingdom had built an extraordinarily centralized system in which the pharaoh's legitimacy and the state's fiscal capacity were both staked entirely on the river's predictability, with provincial structures increasingly subordinate to a central authority that could not, in the end, deliver the one thing its legitimacy depended on. Akkad had built an extractive imperial system whose military and bureaucratic superstructure depended on a narrow agricultural surplus zone that, once it failed, left the empire with no fallback base broad enough to sustain its administrative ambitions. Both systems had optimized for the assumption of stability rather than the possibility of disruption, and both paid an institutional price disproportionate to the actual percentage decline in rainfall, because the fragility was baked into the architecture of the states themselves rather than into the climate event alone. This is the same structural lesson that recurs across every civilizational collapse this channel has examined. The Bronze Age collapse, 3.5 centuries before this one's distant cousin in some ways. The Khmer hydraulic state, the Maya cities abandoned in the jungle. Complex administrative systems built during long stretches of environmental stability tend to optimize for efficiency rather than resilience, concentrating fragility at exactly the points where flexibility would matter most when conditions change. The 4.2 kilo-year event did not single out weak civilizations. It struck 4 of the most sophisticated administrative systems on Earth simultaneously, and all 4 discovered, within the span of a single human lifetime, that sophistication and resilience are not the same quality. Egypt does eventually recover. The fragmented nomarchies of the first intermediate period are eventually reunified, beginning around 2055 BC, under the Theban ruler Mentuhotep II, inaugurating the Middle Kingdom, a state that rebuilds centralized authority, but does so with administrative lessons clearly absorbed from the collapse, including more robust provincial grain storage systems and irrigation infrastructure investment designed explicitly to buffer against flood variability in ways the Old Kingdom had never needed to consider. Mesopotamia recovers more slowly and never under a single unifying state, quite like Akkad's original construction. The region fragments into competing city-states for generations before the third dynasty of Ur briefly reunifies much of the territory, itself destined to fall to drought-adjacent pressures and invasion within little more than a century. The civilizations that built the pyramids and founded the First Empire did not vanish from the historical record, but the specific political and administrative forms that had defined them at their respective peaks did not survive the climate shock intact. What came after in each region was shaped permanently by the memory and the practical lessons of a century when the rivers simply stopped behaving the way every generation before had assumed they always would. The Nilometer at Memphis still exists, in fragments, in the archaeological record. The number it recorded in 2200 BC, the one that told the pharaoh's officials something had gone fundamentally wrong, is one of the earliest pieces of quantitative data in human history, documenting the moment an entire civilizational model met a force it had never been designed to survive.